I was born with a strong scent of sandalwood all over my body. The elderly in the village touched my bones and said that I was born with Buddha bones. Xiangniang was reincarnated, and my grandmother put on the ancestral safety buckle to suppress my fragrance. It wasn't until I was 19 years old that a car accident broke the safety buckle, and from then on, I was entangled by 3 menLiu Jingchen, snake bone. It's been 100 years, Liu Zhenzhen. What you owe me should be paid back. Liu Luoyuan, snake demon. Zhen, have you forgotten all about it? You are my hair-tied wife, and we have a childHu Yunxi, 9-tailed fox. Jingchen, I lit 3,000 eternal lamps on the Huangquan Road, pieced together your soul, and transported you back to the human world. Do you really remember me at all? Chapter 1. The Heavenly Formation of Buddha Bones. You are listening at novelfull.audio. I am the 7th child born to my mother. The first 6 sisters were drowned in lime water by my milk from birth. My milk said that the Liu family can only give birth to males and must also have a pure young body with extremely strong bazi. Otherwise, regardless of whether they give birth to males or females, they will come to collect debts. My mother was 43 years old when she conceived me. I was counting the date with my fingers in my fingers. The expected date of delivery was on the 5th day of May of the next year. She was born at 1 o'clock at noon on the Dragon Boat Festival in the year of the Long, a perfect pure young body. But there were unexpected circumstances. In the early morning of April 8, my father woke up and found that my mother was not in bed. He searched around and finally found her in the Xiangniang temple in the village. For generations, our entire Qinshui village has made a living by making incense. There is a temple dedicated to the goddess of incense in the village, which is bustling with incense. When my mother was discovered, she was standing in front of the altar, her mouth filled with incense ash, her eyes staring like copper bells, holding 3 lit yellow incense sticks in her hand. She had already lost her breath, her stomach had opened a big hole, and inside was rolling one small snake after another. The rich scent of sandalwood mixed with a bloody smell enveloped the entire Xiangniang temple. My dad was so scared at the time that he couldn't control so much. He reached out and pulled at those little snakes. By the time my milk and the villagers arrived, my dad had already been bitten to death by those snakes. His body is protecting me, who is not yet full term, and I am also wrapped in small snakes. The snake's teeth are deep into my skin and flesh, as if they are about to bite through my bones. The villagers rushed forward and rescued me from the pile of snakes, only to realize that the sandalwood fragrance emanating from me was all over the temple. At that time, some people said that the 8th day of the 4th month was originally the birthday of Lady Xiang, and I happened to be born prematurely in the temple with a scent of sandalwood, afraid that it would be the reincarnation of Lady Xiang. The experienced old man even touched my bones on the spot and said that my Buddha bones were naturally formed, which was why I was targeted by those evil creatures who wanted to devour my Buddha bones to help them practice. My breasts wrapped me in my arms, and when I opened my mouth, I scolded them for their nonsense, saying that I had clearly stayed in the temple for a long time before getting the scent of sandalwood. When I went back to take a shower, the fragrance naturally dissipated. Sure enough, when my injuries were healed and my breasts carried me out, there was nothing on me except for the fragrance of milk. Since I can remember, I have been wearing a coin-sized safety buckle around my neck, and my grandmother has repeatedly reminded me not to take it off at any time. At the age of 7, I was caught in the rain on my way back from school, and the red rope on my safety buckle was soaked through. So I took it off and put it on the windowsill to dry. I fell asleep under the blanket. Half asleep and half awake, a heart-wrenching pain suddenly hit my feet. I woke up suddenly and sat up, smelling the scent of sandalwood all over the room. A huge mouse was gnawing on my toes, making me scream in fear. Grandma rushed in, ran away with the mouse, turned around, grabbed the safety buckle and put it around my neck. When the scent of sandalwood in the room completely disappeared, she picked me up and gave me a chubby beating. That was my first time being beaten, and I have a deep memory of it. Since then, I have never taken off the safety buckle again. When I grew up, my grandmother repeatedly instructed me to study hard, not to fall in love, not to be touched by men. When I asked her why, she said that men would make me unhappy. I only consider my grandmother because I am old and afraid that I will run away with a wild man. No one will provide her with retirement. My grandmother and I rely on each other, and she loves me very much. I also listen to her words and focus solely on studying. Until the age of 19 that evening, on my way back to the village from vacation, I had a car accident. The small car overturned on the mountain road, and my seat was directly facing the car door, which threw me out. I rolled down the slope all the way, twisted my foot, and my safety buckle was smashed. A strong sandalwood aroma suddenly erupted, and soon, I heard the sound of rustling around me. I will never forget that day, when countless snakes, insects, mice, and ants rushed up from all directions, staring at me with crimson eyes, as if looking at a piece of fat. I struggled to climb the mountain slope with my limp, shouting for help. Behind me, a weasel rushed forward and bit my injured and bleeding foot, greedily sucking on it. I flipped my body hard and kicked the other foot on its head, even kicking it more than 10 times. The weasel didn't let go of its mouth, but instead bit my foot bone even more viciously. I thought I would die on that hillside until a white snake bone suddenly appeared, biting off the neck of the weasel and sweeping away the surrounding snakes, mice, insects, and ants. The cold snake bone trapped me in the middle, firmly protecting me. When the ambulance arrived, the snake bone suddenly disappeared again. I even felt that what had just happened was an illusion caused by my head being smashed. I was carried on to the ambulance by everyone with all my hands and feet, and I heard them discussing in a low voice, saying that this girl smells so good. When I arrived at the hospital, the doctor helped me straighten my ankle, clean the wound, bandage it, perform the most basic examination, and then get an intravenous drip before I fell asleep. I don't know how long I've been sleeping, but I feel someone breathing on my face. I suddenly open my eyes and face a bloody face. I was scared and was about to scream when my face shouted at me, "Girl, help uncle, please help me. My child is only 3 years old and we can't live without a father. I'll just take a bite, just a bite, please." I looked carefully and it took me a while to recognize him as the driver of a small car. He was not very old, in his 30s, and he was very talkative. Just as I was about to ask him what to take a bite, a tender voice rang out next to me. "Sister, can you give me a bite too? I want to grow up and not be bullied by them. They." I looked around and only then did I realize that I was standing next to my hospital bed, floating above it, and stretching my neck from a distance to look over here. Woo, there are people everywhere in the vast land. Some of them have missing arms and broken legs, some are flesh and blood blurred, some are pale and thin as a piece of paper, some have blue faces and fangs, and look particularly terrifying. No, they are not humans. Drop, a piercing sound of machinery suddenly rang out, accompanied by the desperate cries of the small bus driver, "It's too late, girl. I'm sorry, let me take a bite." As he spoke, he plunged his head down and bit into my ear bone. The piercing cold and pain came, and I screamed and woke up completely. The sound of painful crying came from the next bed, and a young woman was holding a 3-year-old child, crying almost fainting. On the monitoring machine next to the cabinet, there were 3 straight horizontal lines. "The driver of the small bus has died." I looked at it in confusion and unconsciously raised my hand to touch the right ear bone. A wave of pain hit me, and I even felt sticky blood. I didn't fall to my ear in the car accident, and the blood still carries my body temperature. It's clear that it just flowed out. Chapter 2. Yin Xiang. You are listening at novelfull.audio. I watched as the driver of the small bus was covered in a white cloth and lifted away from me, and as the next bed was replaced with new sheets, my whole body was in a daze. At this moment, the nurse was holding an ear thermometer to measure my temperature. When she saw my bleeding ear bone, she exclaimed, "Why are your ears bleeding?" What deep dental marks. Dental imprints. My heart pounded. Did the driver of the small bus really bite my ear bone? But he is clearly dead. What the hell is going on here? The nurse quickly helped me stop bleeding and disinfect again. After finishing her work, she told me that she had already contacted my grandmother, but it was raining heavily outside and it was late at night. The mountain road was difficult, and my grandmother said she would arrive later. I nodded, feeling dizzy and bloated, and lying down feeling drowsy. Sister, help me. The young and frightened voice of the little girl rang out again, and when I opened my eyes, I saw her pinned to the corner of the wall, with a green-faced and fawn-like creature biting her. Those guys around, either excited or fearful, watched this scene without a single one coming forward to stop them. I looked around but couldn't find the driver of the small bus. Sister, please give me a bite. I promise to only take a small bite and it won't hurt you. Please. The little girl's hoarse cries for help lingered in my ears, and my head was about to explode. I was thinking, she had already been pushed into a desperate situation. Why didn't she come up and bite me like a small bus driver? Also, is all of this just a dream or a reality for me? What would happen if she really took a bite? By a stroke of fate, I nodded at the little girl. The little girl, as if granted amnesty, rushed over and bit my left little toe. The intense pain made me wake up completely from bed again. I gasped for breath, my heart pounding, and I lifted the blanket, only to see that the tip of my left little toe was really missing. A chill surged up my spine, and at that moment, I couldn't hold my tension anymore. I shouted, "Ghost! There's a ghost!" I jumped out of the hospital bed with a limp, enduring the pain. As soon as I opened the door, I saw my grandmother rushing in. I hugged her tightly and her voice sounded like shaking a sieve. "Grandma, there are ghosts. They all want to bite me. They will eat me." My breasts hugged me tightly and comforted me, saying, don't be afraid, Grandma is here. Grandma has a way to save you." The nurse also rushed over and saw that I had a missing little toe and blood stains on the ground. She asked me to quickly lie back in bed and stop the bleeding for me. I shook my head and refused to return to the hospital room. I hid behind my breasts, who protected me and strongly demanded that I be discharged. "You can't save my pastor, I need to take her back to the village, otherwise she won't survive tonight." My attitude was resolute, protecting me as I walked outside. In the end, I left the hospital without even completing the discharge procedures. The village chief's van was waiting at the entrance of the hospital. As soon as the car door opened, a strong smell of fishy smell rushed towards me, making me cough. My milk stuffed me into the back seat, closed the car door, and helped me with my breath while saying, "The car has been lit with exorcism incense, which can temporarily cover up the sandalwood smell on your body, but the safety button is broken. You have already been targeted, and exorcism incense can only confuse those who have no professional skills. When encountering a villainous character, none of us can escape tonight. The village chief has started the car and sped away on a rainy night." I curled up in the back seat and asked nervously, "Milk, what's going on here? What should I do?" Grandma reached out to stroke my hair, her eyes filled with heartache, and said, "Zhen, you are already 19 years old and of age. There are some things that should be told to you." She took out a small rectangular box made of golden nanmo from her feet, placed it on my lap, and opened it. The small box is divided into 2 layers, with the first layer only half the size of the second layer. On the first layer, there is a snake-shaped sandalwood incense with a black body and a faint snake-like smell. On the second layer, there are 10 other incense sticks arranged side by side, each with a different shape and color. Each stick is wrapped in red oil paper, and the name of each incense stick is written on the oil paper. childHu village makes a living by making incense. I have been exposed to it since I was young, and there are almost no popular fragrances on the market that I cannot name. But these 10 fragrances, I have never heard of them before. These are all the incense passed down by the ancestors of the Liu family, my milk suddenly spoke out, and they are also things that your grandfather repeatedly told me before his death, asking me to personally pass on to the future heir of the Liu family's incense. I don't understand. Yin Xiang. All things in the world are harmonious between yin and yang. People are divided into men and women, and incense is also divided into yin and yang. The vast majority of the various fragrances circulating on the market are yang fragrances, commonly used for incense, worship, disease treatment, and so on. However, the ancestors of our Liu family made yin fragrances, which can communicate with souls, cross the cycle of unjust souls, trace back to past and present lives, and live to death with flesh and bones. I pointed to the small box and continued, these are the last 10 incense sticks uploaded by the dear ancestor. I pointed to the snake-shaped sandalwood on the upper layer and asked, what about this one? Isn't it yin incense? My milk took out the snake-shaped sandalwood and closed the small box before saying, Yin Xiang is precious and has unique effects. It is not something that ordinary people can make or maintain. The dear family can make Yin Xiang thanks to the protection of the snake lord that has always been worshipped in the family. 100 years ago, something happened that angered Snake Lord. The entire submerged village was almost destroyed by him. Later, the Xiangniang temple was built in the village, which completely suppressed Snake Lord's town. However, since then, the Liu family has been cursed, and their offspring have been struggling. Each baby girl born has a serious skin disease in her womb, and none of them can survive a full moon. Her whole body rots and smells, and when she dies, only a handful of bones remain, speaking of which, my milk choked up a few times. I suddenly realized, so my sick sisters. Rather than suffering from torture and dying, it's better to give them a good time. I wiped away my tears and continued, but Zhen, you're different from them. Your Buddha bone is naturally formed and you can withstand the curse. And on the day you were born, the statue of Lady Xiang cracked open, the seal was already lifted, but the Snake Lord never retaliated. Perhaps you can turn the fate of the Liu family around. She put the snake-shaped sandalwood into my hand and said earnestly, ignite this snake-shaped sandalwood, and it is possible to summon the Snake Lord to appear. Currently, he is the only one who can save and protect you. However, once it is ignited, there will be a connection between you and the Snake Lord, whether it is good or bad. No one can say for sure, whether it will be chosen or not, Pastor. You can make your own decision, whether the Snake Lord will come or not, and Grandma cannot guarantee it. Zhi, the piercing sound of brakes echoed coldly, causing the car to jolt. I quickly protected the snake-shaped sandalwood with my eyes and hands, looked forward, and suddenly took a deep breath. Within the range that the front lights of the car can illuminate, it drizzled continuously, and within that rain curtain, 7 or 8 yellow weasels of different sizes stood there. The leader has long eyebrows, pale fur, and a faint human expression. Chapter 3. This is what you owe me. You are listening at novelfull.audio. When I was a child, I heard from the elderly in the village that the higher the cultivation level of a yellow-skinned person, the lighter their fur color, and turning white means they need to transform. At this point, it will look for a destined person and ask them if they think I look like a person. If a destined person says something like it, it can successfully transform into a form. If it's not like it, after years of cultivation, it will eventually make people restless. And the white-haired weasel in front of me is probably in the bottleneck period of transformation. Judging from this posture, it is not to ask if it looks like a human. I suddenly remembered, isn't this mountain road the place where the small bus overturned in the evening? At that time, the small bus was driving well and suddenly overturned. Is it also related to these weasels? And after I rolled down the mountain slope, the weasel that bit me so hard, shouldn't it be with them? That weasel was ultimately bitten off by a snake bone and had its neck broken. Are they here to seek revenge on me? Is it still aimed at my body full of Buddha bones? Just as I was thinking about these things, I suddenly heard my breasts grit their teeth and say, "Village chief, run over." The village chief immediately stepped on the gas pedal, and the van roared as it crashed towards the pack of yellow rats and wolves. The white-haired yellow rats and wolves tiptoed to the ground and jumped up like an arrow, piercing through the front window of the car and biting into the village chief's hand. The village chief let out a painful cry and shook his hand hard, but couldn't shake off the white-haired yellow weasel. A few yellow weasels from behind rushed in and rushed towards me and my grandmother. The van was rampaging along the mountain road, and we couldn't sit steadily. Those yellow weasels were obviously skilled, and as one of them was about to bite my nose, a tender fist came out from behind me and hit the weasel's head hard. "Sister, get off the car quickly. These yellow-skinned ones have many paths to cultivate yin and evil, they want to devour your Buddha bones." It's a little girl who gnawed on my little toe. How could she be here? As the little girl spoke, she got into a fight with those yellow weasels. I tried hard to push the car door, but it couldn't move at all. The car door seems to have been welded to death, and the same goes for my breasts. Just as I was desperately kicking the car door, a small snake hung down the car window from the roof and hissed out snake venom at me. Immediately after, the second and third snakes. In no time, various small snakes were hanging outside the car window, constantly wriggling. The car glass was damaged, and the fragrance of the exorcism fragrance dissipated, unable to conceal the sandalwood scent on my body, and those things tangled up again. It turns out to be a spiritual body that has swallowed Buddha bones. Children, come and taste this delicious food to drive away evil spirits from their bodies. The white-haired weasel actually spoke. I looked forward and saw the little girl being stomped on her back with one foot, tightly holding it down. The other weasels rushed towards her with a thud, mercilessly tearing at her soul. I leaned forward to grab her, but the little girl shook her head at me and said, "Sister, don't come over, they will eat you." Let's go, let's go." "Where are you going?" The white-haired weasel walked towards me step by step, with its small eyes as big as soybeans shining brightly. "This little figure looks really handsome. It must be so fragrant and delicious." I protected me like a chicken and threatened, "Don't touch my granddaughter." Bang! I only saw the white-haired weasel twitch its arm, and my breasts were thrown out, fiercely hitting the car door. At that time, I fainted. In front of me, the village chief lay motionless on the steering wheel, and the little girl's soul gradually faded. The rolling little snake crawled into the car through the hole in the front window. The car was controlled by a white-haired weasel, and I couldn't get out. As time passed, the scent of sandalwood in the carriage became heavier, attracting more evil creatures. A layer of cold sweat broke out in my palms, almost soaking the snake-shaped sandalwood. I don't know if it's an illusion, but the snake-shaped sandalwood in my hands became colder and colder, and waves of cold air drilled straight into my bones, as if it would turn into a sinister venomous snake and jump out in the next moment. Snake fragrance. "Do you want to summon Mr. Liu?" The white-haired weasel paused at his feet and opened his mouth to announce the name and origin of the incense. He then sneered, "Who doesn't know on this road?" 100 years ago, Mr. Liu was cramped and had his gallbladder dug out, leaving only a pair of bones. He was even suppressed in a copper coffin. Even if you burn 10 more snake incense, you can't summon him out. "Little girl, no one can save you today." The white-haired weasel sneered and rushed forward, but its target was the snake fragrance in my hand. If it really didn't fear the owner behind this snake fragrance, how could it be so eager to destroy it? At that moment, there was only one thought in my mind. This snake fragrance could really save our lives. No matter what I summon after lighting it up, at least I have to save the lives of my grandmother and village chief first. I protected the snake fragrance on one side and blew a strong breath towards it. Sparks suddenly appeared from the snake fragrance, and strands of green smoke mixed with the snake smell erupted. A gloomy wind rose from the ground, accompanied by a mournful creaking and hissing sound, and several yellow weasels and those small snakes in the carriage all turned into corpses. The white-haired weasel trembled and stuttered in his voice, "Liu. Mr. Liu. When did you leave the level? Do I need to inform you in advance when I leave the border?" Senbai's snake bones wrapped around the neck of the white-haired weasel, and the tip of its tail pressed against its throat bone. The man's voice was filled with anger. "My people, you dare not move, seek death." Without hesitation, the snake bone pierced through the neck of the white-haired weasel, and the foul-smelling black blood rushed out. The white-haired weasel didn't even have time to let out a muffled groan, so it widened its small eyes and fell down. A white shadow flashed in front of me, and I only felt a tightness in my waist. The wind blew in my ears, and when I landed again, I was already standing in the sunken village, my own room. The snake bones that brought me back are still there. The white snake bones were wrapped around me, and I wanted to escape, but I couldn't even move. I didn't know why it was pitch black in front of me, and I couldn't see anything. Vaguely, I felt something holding my waist in my hand. Still slowly tightening. I was completely pressed against the wall, and the snake fragrance was also sucked away. I struggled frantically, and finally seemed to see something, but it was a phantom of a man. He was wearing a crown and a moon-white robe, with the corners dyed in deep black blood. I couldn't see his appearance clearly, but those eyes, filled with crazy hatred, stared at me intently. He suddenly lowered his head and kissed me, lingering around my neck, gnawing and biting, with force so strong that it seemed like he was about to eat me. The hand around his waist was not idle, stirring up trouble everywhere. I lived for 19 years, not even holding a man's hand. Where did I experience all of this? My whole body trembled and almost cried. The sound of fabric tearing rang out, and I exclaimed in fear, "No way." From childhood to adulthood, my grandmother has reminded me countless times not to let men touch me. But this inexplicable snake bone naturally couldn't listen to me. The blurry and cool shadow firmly nailed me to death, kissing me even more fiercely. A cold breath surged straight into my body, and I trembled violently. Does he also want to eat me? I panicked and pushed him, but he grabbed me tightly and forcefully, causing me to cry out in pain. "It hurts." But the phantom did not stop at all, even harder, until in the end, it shouted another unfamiliar name in my ear. "Liu Xiang, this is what you owe me." The hatred and coldness in that voice finally scared me unconscious. Chapter 4. Snake Bone Bracelets. You are listening at novelfull.audio. I had been dreaming in a daze. I dreamt of Huang Sangu, who had died for many years. When I was a child, she coaxed me to touch my bones, saying that she didn't touch me wrong when I was born. I am a natural Buddha bone, and every bone on my body is the aspiration of practitioners. Among these 206 bones, there is one called the heavenly bone, which can become a Buddha and an immortal on the ground. As the screen turned, I dreamt of the snake bone again. It tightly wrapped around me, and the blurry phantom kneaded every part of my body, as if searching for something. Finally, he found what he wanted, his slender and powerful fingers deeply inserted into my flesh, and blood gushed out. Ah! No! I suddenly woke up in shock and sat up from the bed, holding myself in both hands and shrinking into the bed. My eyes were flustered as I scanned around, leaving the room empty and empty. Has he left? Did you really leave? Or is everything that happened before just a dream for me? But when my gaze swept over my left hand, my whole body froze as if someone had poured a basin of ice water on my head. I don't know when I was wearing a snow-white snake bone bracelet on my left wrist. It should be a section of the snake's tail bone, strung in a circle, with a seal attached at the junction of the head and tail. The seal has snake-like patterns and 3 characters engraved in small seal script at the bottom. The seal is stained with a lot of blood, which may have been a bit old. The blood stains turn black and cover the handwriting at the bottom. I can only vaguely recognize the character of Liu. Liu. Is it the willow of Liu Sanyi in the mouth of the white-haired weasel? Did he put the snake bone bracelet on me? I tried hard to ignore the snake bone, but only felt a chill constantly seeping out of it and piercing into my bone marrow. It felt like being stared at by a pair of cold eyes, making me restless. I couldn't help but try to pull the snake bone off, but it was okay if I didn't pull it. The more I pulled, the tighter the snake bone became, and it even squeezed into the flesh, oozing blood. I got out of bed and found scissors. I wanted to cut the snake bone, but the scissors were shattered. Until I gave up and let go, the snake bones barely returned to their original state. I have put in so much effort, but still cannot unlock it. Instead, it stained my blood, and the pale snake bones seemed to have become even warmer. I slumped by the bed, feeling a chill rising in my heart as I was entangled. I was completely entangled by that snake bone. What should we do? What should I do? Grandma. Snake fragrance was given to me by my grandmother, she must know something. I searched around the house and made sure that my grandmother had not returned. I was afraid that she and the village chief would be left in that car, so I prepared to go out. It was still raining outside, and I was in a mess again. I turned around and found a clean set of clothes to change into. When I changed clothes, I suddenly realized that the scent of sandalwood had disappeared from the previous room. I lowered my head and sniffed my hands and arms carefully again. I really couldn't smell anything at all. What's going on here? I glanced at the snake bone bracelet and my heart moved. My family's ancestral safety buckle can suppress the overflow of Buddha bone sandalwood fragrance. Can this snake bone bracelet also be used? I didn't dare to think much, so I took my grandmother's coat and umbrella and walked out the door, strode towards the village entrance. When passing by the village chief's house, I saw his van parked outside the courtyard, with the gate open and the lights shining brightly inside, and faint sounds coming from inside. Has the village chief and grandmother returned? I stood outside the courtyard and shouted loudly, "Milk, are you there?" As soon as I finished speaking, a few people screamed and ran out of the main house, with some scratches on their bodies. Before I could react, I saw the village chief following behind. He crossed the threshold in a strange posture, chasing his family towards the entrance of the courtyard. His eyes were crimson, with a tuft of yellow-white hair growing on his cheeks. His slightly open lips revealed two sharp teeth, which were still stained with blood. His fingernails were thin, long, and extremely sharp. When he saw me, he suddenly became excited and kept grinding his teeth. His saliva couldn't stop flowing out, as if he was salivating for some earthly delicacy. But that earthly delicacy. It seems like it's me. I instinctively took 2 steps back and saw my breasts pulling a hemp rope and throwing it from behind the village chief, suddenly gripping his neck. The village head grabbed the rope and struggled. I was small and old, and soon became a little powerless. At that time, I had no fear. I strode into the yard, looked around, grabbed the shovel at the corner of the east yard, and smashed it into the village head's knee. The village chief howled and knelt on the ground. I took the opportunity to wrap the hemp rope around the village chief's body, finally tying it tightly. I leaned against the corner of the wall, covered my thighs, and sucked in the air. I just saw that there were injuries all over my breasts, and there was a big gap in my thighs that was bitten open. The skin and flesh that was flipped out had an abnormal purple-black color. I threw away the shovel and knelt beside my breast to check her wound, but she suddenly grabbed my left hand and stared at the snake bone bracelet on my wrist with complicated eyes. I opened my mouth to ask my grandmother if she could take off the snake bone bracelet, but she suddenly pushed away my hand and stuffed both of her hands under the hem of her clothes, as if avoiding something. But I saw it. I saw my grandmother's nails becoming sharp and thin, and she also had yellow and white hair growing on her cheeks, just like the village chief's. She tightly closed her mouth. The little old lady was in her 70s and had lost a few teeth. Her mouth was usually a bit flat, but now its bulging inside. The village chief was still struggling, with a constant roar like that of a wild beast in his throat. I looked at the village chief and then at my grandmother, and an ominous premonition struck my heart. I exclaimed, "Grandma, you!" Grandma stood up all of a sudden, pulled me up and pushed me out, pushing me onto the village chief's van. She took out a bank card from her close-fitting pocket and stuffed it into my hand, reminding me, "Zhen, you drive back to school. The card contains the tuition fees I have saved for you. Study hard and stay in the provincial capital to work and live in the future. Don't come back again. Let's go now." As she opened her mouth, 2 sharp teeth were exposed. I watched as those 2 teeth flickered back and forth between her lips, trembling uncontrollably. I remembered the scene of a white-haired weasel biting the village chief, which was sinister and likely infected with some virus. The village chief bit his grandmother again, and her grandmother was also infected. I held my grandmother's hand and pulled her into the car, saying, "Grandma, did you get infected with the virus carried by the weasel? I'll take you to the hospital now." My breasts pushed me hard and shook my head, saying, "Silly girl, the hospital can't help us. You go. If you don't go, there won't be enough time. I have relied on my grandmother since I was young. She is the closest and most important person in my life. How could I possibly leave her behind?" I jumped out of the car, picked her up from behind, and stuffed her into the car. I fought my best to arch down, but I didn't cooperate. Just as we were arguing, the family of the village chief who had run out before returned. They were staring at me with crimson eyes, grinding their teeth, and drooling as they surrounded me. Chapter 5. 1000-Step Fragrance. You are listening at novelfull.audio. No, it's not just those few people from the village head's family. I saw a constant stream of villagers moving towards us in the darkness, all of them injured and bitten. If this continues, our entire submerged village will become a human purgatory. My milk's condition is also very bad. She kept yelling low, reaching out to hit her head, trying to stay awake, but her eyes had also turned red, and soon her rationality would be completely swallowed up. The van is not safe anymore. I can't stay outside as a live target and can only go and grab my breasts. I have to take her to a relatively safe place first, but I accidentally saw the golden nano box on the back seat of the van. Yin Xiang. I have said that the Yin fragrance of the Liu family can communicate with the soul, cross the cycle of unjust souls, and even live and die with flesh and bones. It is so magical that it must also be able to detoxify this weasel, right? I picked up the box in one hand, grabbed my milk in the other, quickly retreated to the village chief's yard, locked the door, and dragged something behind it. The villagers chased over and lay on the courtyard door, roaring, their nails constantly scraping against the door panels, making a piercing sound. I secretly looked out through the crack in the door, facing a pair of crimson eyes. He also saw me and suddenly became excited. He reached out and inserted his hand into the crack, painfully grabbing me with all his might. His upper and lower teeth were grinding, and he wished he could pull me out of the crack, peel my skin, eat my meat, and drink my blood. I was so scared that my whole body couldn't stop trembling, but just then, the same creaking sound of grinding my teeth came from behind me. I turned my head bit by bit, praying in my heart not to be my milk, but saw my grandmother pounce with crimson eyes. I was thrown to the ground by her, struggling desperately to remember that the usually thin and weak little old lady was now like a cow, with endless strength. My breasts have completely lost their sanity. She is pressing down on me, showing her newly grown fangs, desperately trying to pierce them into my body. I held my hands and distanced myself from her, saliva dripping down my fangs, one by one onto my face, making me nauseous and scared. As I watched my milk face get closer and closer to me, the pair of pale fangs were hanging on my nose. It was only a little bit close, and she was about to bite it off. I couldn't care anymore and kicked my milk leg hard, causing my milk calf to stumble. I took the opportunity to push her aside, picked up the golden nanmo box on the ground, and crawled into the kitchen closest to me. As soon as I entered the kitchen, I immediately closed all the doors and windows, blocking everything that could be dragged in the kitchen behind them. I shrunk to the edge of the stove and hugged myself tightly. From time to time, my milk roars in my ear, "She's looking for me." After a while, I only heard a loud bang, the courtyard door was knocked open, and the villagers rushed in. The crouching roar and grinding sound made me despair. I even pinched the lighter on the stove, thinking that if I couldn't escape in the end, I would die with them. In a panic, I knocked over the golden Nanmo box, and the incense fell out from inside. Along with the bright yellow silk lining the bottom, it also spread out, revealing a burnt yellow paper. I pulled out the yellow paper and saw some names of Yin Xiang and their functions written on it. The names of those incense sticks match the incense sticks in the golden Nanmo box, but this yellow paper is somewhat old, torn and rotten, and has been burned. Some have names but no effect, while others record their effects and their names are burned down, making it completely mismatched. I took a rough glance and instantly aimed at a Yin incense called childHu Xiang. On the yellow paper, it was written, "childHu Xiang, ignite it, there is a fragrance within 1,000 steps, it has the function of calming the mind, dispelling evil, and avoiding taboos." A short sentence gave me great hope. Exorcism and taboo. Isn't this just right for the symptoms? I grabbed the fallen incense and quickly found 1,000-step fragrance, igniting it without hesitation. A faint fishy smell quickly spread in the air, and I felt my pores all over my body opening up. My whole body instantly became refreshed, and the door gradually quieted down. I carefully looked out through the crack in the door and saw the villagers in the yard standing there in confusion at first. The redness in their eyes slowly faded away, and their fingernails returned to normal. Then they collapsed one by one, feeling exhausted and falling asleep. "childHu Xiang is really effective, we have been saved." I finally breathed a sigh of relief, turned around, picked up the other scattered incense on the ground, and put it back into the box. When I picked up the yellow paper again, I saw the introduction to childHu fragrance, not just that line. There is also a line of small characters below. The fragrance lasts for 3 days, supplemented by the fragrance of chicken tongue, and the fragrance is introduced. Rice in a jar. This line of small characters is like a bolt from the blue, making my just relaxed mood suddenly become solemn again. If my understanding is correct, the effect of 1,000-step incense is only 3 days, and its efficacy is too gentle to completely remove the yellow immortal poison from the villagers. To completely rescue the villagers, another type of Yin incense called chicken tongue incense must be made. Among the remaining 9 incense sticks in the golden silk Nanmo box, there is not a single one that smells like chicken tongue. I suddenly panicked. I just narrowly escaped death. Where should I go to get the chicken tongue fragrance? If there is no chicken tongue fragrance in 3 days, what will the villagers become? I dare not think further, so I can only put away the incense first, hoping that perhaps the villagers are not deeply poisoned, and the 1,000-step incense will be completely sufficient. I moved the things behind the door and helped my breasts up. Suddenly, a villager next to me moved, which scared me and made my soul fly. I bent down and stood there, not daring to show any signs of grandeur. As I watched the villager slowly sit up, he looked at me and then at the villagers lying on the ground, wondering, "Pastor, what's going on here?" I didn't know how to explain to him for a moment, but fortunately, the villagers around me woke up one by one. They still had some memories of being bitten, and soon started chatting on their own. After my breasts woke up, she first sniffed her nose and smelled the fragrance of childHu in the air. Her eyebrows furrowed immediately, and then she looked at me, her eyes becoming extremely complex. I saw guilt, reluctance, and helplessness in her eyes. But she didn't say anything in the end, turned around and told the villagers not to wander around in the village chief's yard these days. I think my milk should know the efficacy of childHu Xiang, right? After a day of tinkering, everyone was very tired and huddled in the corner to take a nap. I am also very tired, but I dare not sleep. The small words on the yellow paper are lingering in my heart. I helped wrap the wound on my thigh with milk and went to the kitchen to cook for everyone. When I was on fire, the village chief came in from outside and said he was thirsty. He came to scoop a bowl of water to drink. The village chief was the first to be bitten and also the most severely injured, but after smelling the fragrance of 1,000 steps, he also regained consciousness, and the yellow hair and sharp nails on his face also receded. I watched him scoop up a bowl of water and bring it to his mouth, but instead of opening his mouth to drink, he stuck out his tongue and kept rolling the water into his mouth. I am completely frozen. How could the village chief drink water like this? Like a dog. Chapter 6. Everyone must die. Everyone has to die. You are listening at novelfull.audio. No, it's not right. Rather than saying that the village chief drinks water like a dog, it's better to say that he looks like a weasel. It seems that the poison of Huang Xian has not been completely removed from the bodies of the villagers by Xiang. I began to observe the behavior habits of the villagers intentionally or unintentionally, and soon discovered many things that were not right. In the evening, a mournful rooster crowing sounded behind the yard. When I ran to the back of the yard, I saw the village chief holding a big rooster, desperately tearing and sucking on its blood. He was so intoxicated that he didn't even hear my footsteps. His hands and mouth were covered in chicken feathers and blood. I saw that yellow hair had grown faintly on his cheeks again, and his fangs had also grown. It seems that Xiang has been ineffective against him. I tried my best to preserve a trace of reason and quietly retreated to the yard, pulling my milk to a separate room, asking her to lock the door, stop contacting other villagers, and wait for me to come back. Grandma, I must go find the rice in the jar. Grandma's rationality was obviously a bit overwhelming, but she still tightly grasped my hand and squeezed it hard. I know, Grandma is worried about me. I pressed her shoulder to calm her down and said, Milk, I'm going to Zhennan to find the Tong family now. You stay here and wait for me to come back. Zhennan Tongjia, that is a famous bully who travels from south to north. My grandfather has been with them since he was alive, and they must have rice in a jar in their hands. I settled down my grandmother and resolutely left the village. In the village filled with mournful crowing of chickens, a strange admonition sounded faintly. Rice in a jar, not stained with blood, not stained with evil, used once, you'll have to throw it away. I drove the village chief's van all the way towards the south of the town. My feet are still slightly hurting, and the car is driving very slowly. As I passed through the mountain road where the accident occurred, my heart was pounding uncontrollably, afraid that something might go wrong again. Fortunately, everything went smoothly. When I arrived in town, I was so hungry that my chest pressed against my back. When I had a car accident, I also lost my phone, and the village chief's van was broken and old. There was no navigation, so I decided to have breakfast on the roadside and ask for directions. I found a steamed bun shop, and although breakfast was over, the landlady was very enthusiastic, tidying up while chatting with me. I asked her if she knew about Huilong village near the town, and she immediately became interested. Huilong village, it was renamed Changshu village 2 years ago, because there are many elderly people in the village who live a long life. Our local TV station has reported on it several times. The boss also interjected, it seems like at the beginning of last year, I heard that a developer was planning to build a resort at the foot of Huilong village mountain. Shortly after the construction started, a few people died, and the resort matter came to an end. How many people died in a row? I exclaimed in surprise, is it a work-related injury? The boss shook his head and said, I'm not sure about the specifics either. It's been rumored from the outside world that the construction team started digging up the mountain and angered the mountain god, sacrificing those few lives to heaven. The landlady also nodded mysteriously and said, as the saying goes, when you open a mountain or break a temple, you should first worship the main god. In this way of life and work, you still need to always have a heart of awe. Miss, don't you think so? I nodded and instinctively shrunk my left hand wearing a snake bone bracelet into my sleeve, then asked, "Boss, do you know if there is a family named Tong in Huilong village?" "Tong family, that's a wealthy family." As the boss lady spoke, she took out her phone and played around for a while, handing it to me. I brought it over and saw that it turned out to be a video from a local TV station interviewing Huilong village a few years ago. In the video, it is introduced that the Tong family lived together for 6 generations without any separation. There were a total of 37 members in the entire family, and the oldest ancestor was 104 years old at that time. The landlady sighed and said, "If the resort can be successfully built, this Tong family will definitely follow the big fire." Nowadays, people's lives are under great pressure and their physical fitness is generally not high. Who wouldn't want to learn from the elderly and strive to live for 180 years? It's really a pity. The boss sneered softly, 6 generations of the same family in a 100-year-old family. "Did you forget about last month?" I perked up my ears and asked, "Last month?" The landlady patted her thigh and said, "How could I forget about this? Just last month, the ambulance passed by our door and pulled a little doll to the town hospital. I also went to see it. It was a little girl, 6 or 7 years old, and I heard she was from the Tong family. That child's face was pale, so thin that only a handful of bones were left. There was not a single strand of hair on his head, and his body was covered in bruises and black scars. It looked like he had been sucked in by something, dead for many days, and had already grown necrotic spots." The boss's wife spoke as if she remembered something, shivering coldly. The boss's face was also not good, and she kicked her, cursing and saying, "Hurry up and tidy up early in the morning. We'll have to face each other later." I quickly asked the landlady to go ahead and finish the buns in my hand. After asking for the route, I got on the car and drove south all the way. I don't know why, but the boss's words always make me unconsciously think of the little girl who gnawed on my little toe. At that time, her soul was eaten by a weasel in the car, and it was already very faint. I don't know what happened to her afterwards. Is it possible that it has already been extinguished? The road gradually became bumpy, and passing through a bamboo forest path ahead, I was about to enter the village. I shook my head and didn't think about anything else. I focused on driving. About 10 minutes later, the van slowly drove into Huilong village. As soon as I entered the village entrance, the snake bone bracelet on my left wrist began to tighten incessantly, and the pale snake bone was causing me a bit of pain. I felt inexplicably uneasy and looked up at the entire village. Huilong village is surrounded by mountains on 3 sides, and the village is very large, but there are not many residents. There are only 30 or 40 households, each with a yard. It has just rained, and the water vapor in the mountains is heavy. It is hazy, and the humid wind blows in from the hole in the front glass of the car. In the summer, I feel a bit cold. Moving forward, several households passing by all had tightly closed courtyard doors, with yellow talismans pasted on the door heads. Some even had yellow talismans pasted on the outside of the courtyard walls. I'm a bit puzzled. What are all the good ones labeled with yellow symbols for? Is it true that, as the owner of the steamed bun shop said, he was retaliated by the mountain god when he returned to Longchuan to start the mountain construction? Just as I was thinking about it, a figure stumbled towards me. I quickly put down the car window and asked loudly, "Hello, may I ask how to get to the Tong family?" As the person approached, I realized that his footsteps were floating, his hair was dirty, and he was tangled up in knots. It wasn't clear how long he hadn't washed it, and his clothes were torn and tattered, making it difficult to distinguish their original colors. As he moved, a foul odor hit my face, making me feel a bit nauseous. He turned around and pointed back, muttering incoherently, "The Tong family. Isn't that the Tong family? I'm dead. I'm almost dead. Everyone has to die. Everyone has to die. Ha ha ha. Ha ha ha." He spoke in a frenzy, his dark hands pounding from the front of the van to the back. I was so scared that I tightly gripped the steering wheel with both hands, not daring to show any signs of grandeur. Encountering such a madman, you don't know if his fist will hit you in the next moment. I can only try to reduce my presence and secretly glance at him from the rearview mirror. He turned around as if he knew I was peeking at him, grabbed the front of his clothes with both hands, laughed heartily, and shouted at me, "We all have to die. We all have to die." I was so scared that my heart almost jumped out of my throat. I stepped on the gas and rushed towards the Tong family. After getting off the car, I wrapped my clothes tightly and rushed to the entrance of the children's home. I slammed the door hard and occasionally glanced back, afraid that the madman would turn back. After taking photos for a long time, the courtyard door finally creaked open, revealing a pale face from inside. That was a woman in her 30s, so thin that she was only skin and bones. She wore a hat on her head and couldn't see her hair. On her exposed skin, she could see scattered purple-black scars, much like the kind of necrotic spots that appeared on a person many days after death. When I observed her, she was also looking at me. At the moment when her eyes met, she suddenly screamed in terror, "Ghost! Ghost!" Chapter 7. Fragrance Testing. You are listening at novelfull.audio. With a loud bang, the courtyard door was closed, and outside the door, I could hear the woman shouting ghosts like she was killing a pig. I stood up with sweat all over my body, squinting my eyes and turning my head bit by bit, afraid of getting into something terrible. But there's nothing behind me. I looked around and suddenly realized that the ghost that the woman was talking about wasn't me, was it? I reached out and touched my face. Although I haven't slept well these past 2 days, I shouldn't be like a ghost, right? I think her face looks like a ghost. I was just thinking when the gate opened again. The person who opened the door this time was an elderly man who was about the same age as me. He was wearing a Zhongshan suit, black cloth shoes on his feet, and his triangular eyes were shining brightly. He scanned me from top to bottom, and his gaze finally froze on my face. He asked, "Girl, who are you looking for?" I quickly said, "I am Liu Zhenzhen, the granddaughter of Liu Shirlei. I am here to visit Mr. Tong Jixin." Liu Shirlei's granddaughter. The old man touched his chin and said, "Let's talk first." He turned over and I stepped into the door, which was immediately closed. The old man walked ahead, and I followed behind. His footsteps were very light, and he walked almost silently. I had to jog to keep up with his pace. There are 37 members of the Tong family, all living in this courtyard with 2 entrances. I followed the old man all the way back and met many people. They looked at me with fear and exploration in their eyes, and even the younger generation dared not look at me. What makes me even more strange is that the young people of the Tong family seem to be very afraid of the cold. In the summer, they are tightly wrapped, wearing hats, and pulling them all the way to the bottom of their ears, not even a single strand of hair can be seen. I also saw the woman who had opened the door before, hiding behind the pillar and looking at me timidly, trembling uncontrollably as if she had actually seen a ghost. The old man took me to the main hall and poured me a cup of tea before saying, "Over 40 years have passed in a blink of an eye. I still remember your grandfather's last visit to me was to buy me a safety buckle the size of a copper coin. That safety buckle was personally brought back by me from a Tang dynasty princess. The princess had become a corpse, but there was no odor on her body, all suppressed by that safety buckle. I still remember your grandfather saying at the time that he bought the safety buckle to pass on to the heir of the Liu family's Yin Xiang. He was already in poor health at that time and was a priceless item. I only wanted him a small goldfish, but I didn't expect that he would be gone the night he returned originally. The safety buckle my grandmother gave me was bought by my grandfather from the Tong family before his death. So the old man in front of me is Tong Jixin. Listening to his words, more than 40 years ago, he and my grandfather did have a deep friendship, and my heart slightly calmed down. I was pondering how to open my mouth to pick up the rice from the jar when Tong Jixin had already said, "Since your grandfather passed away, there has been no further communication between the Tong and Liu families. Today, when you suddenly come over, you must have asked me for help with something that is life-threatening, right?" I quickly nodded and said, "Grandpa Tong guessed well. Something happened at my house these days, and I came here to buy something from Grandpa Tong." Tong Jixin understood in his heart, "What you want to buy is used as a fragrance, right? Do you know what this means?" "A little bit of Yin Xiang represents the reopening of the Liu family Yin Xiang hall," I struggled, "but reopening the Yin Xiang hall was not my intention. I was trying to save people." "Grandpa Tong, do you have a clean jar of rice in your hand?" Tong Jixin smiled and said, "Since you have already come to your door, you should be clear about what the ancestors of the Tong family do. The rice in the jar is not a rare object with me. Today is your first visit, and the rice in the jar can be considered as a gift from my elder to meet you." I was extremely excited and said, "Grandpa Tong, could you help me? I am already very grateful. You must accept the money that should be collected." As I spoke, I took out the bank card that I had previously stuffed into my milk and handed it to Tong Jixin. Tong Jixin didn't take over, but said meaningfully, "Anyway, with the reopening of the Yin Xiang Hall, the business dealings between the Tong and Liu families will continue. Girl, we have a long way to go." After he finished speaking, he asked me to wait and went into the inner room to retrieve the rice from the jar. I sat in the main hall holding a teacup and waited. As the rice in the jar settled, I relaxed and only then could I smell the aroma of the tea. I lowered my head and took several sips. When Tong Jixin came out again, holding a wooden box in his hand, he handed it to me. I opened the lid and saw an antique pottery jar inside. The pottery jar is well preserved, and the grains inside are full and clean. I still remember the strange voice I heard before leaving the village saying, rice in the jar, not stained with blood, not stained with evil, used once, you have to throw it away." I carefully checked the rice in the jar in my hand, there were no bloodstains, and I didn't feel any evil energy. Tong Jixin said, "Don't worry, the rice in this jar is a burial item. I brought it from a folk archaeological team a few years ago and it's absolutely clean." I thanked Tong Jixin repeatedly, and he stayed with me for lunch. I returned home like an arrow, bid farewell to the Tong family, and drove away from Huilong village. As the van was driving away from the village entrance, I ran into that crazy man again. He was sitting on a large stone at the entrance of the village and kept shouting, "We all have to die. We all have to die." I didn't dare to make any stops. I pressed the accelerator all the way and the van sped back to Longsuan. I waited until it reached town before slowing down. At around 2 o'clock, when I came back with rice in a jar, I smelled the bloody smell in the air at the entrance of the village. Villagers who had once again lost their sanity scattered everywhere in the village, constantly roaring and searching. The chickens, ducks, geese, and birds in the village, anyone who could catch them, were all spat out by them. I parked my car at the village entrance, carefully avoiding them and returning to my own home. As soon as I got home, I closed the doors and windows tightly, counted 7 grains of rice from the pottery jar, put them on a piece of yellow paper, ground them into ash, and mixed them with rooster blood and yellow incense ash. Slowly knead and shaped them into 3 fragrant threads. I lit the incense stick, held my breath and stared at it, observing how it burned. If the rice in this jar has been contaminated with evil substances or reused, it will turn black during the kneading process. The fire cannot be ignited, but it will emit black smoke on its own, and the burning speed is several times higher than normal. This is the fragrance testing method that my milk has taught me before, but it came in handy today. The 3 incense sticks I needed were yellow-orange in color, and after being ignited, there were sparks and wisps of green smoke slowly lingering around the incense sticks. This is high-quality and clean rice in a jar, and Tong Jixin did not deceive me as expected. Next, I will start making chicken tongue incense. Although I have never made incense before, I have helped me milk many types of spices from childhood to adulthood. When making some rare spices, there are many procedures and rules. I think the process of making incense should be similar to that of making rare spices. I took it step by step slowly, not daring to make any mistakes. Strangely, from the beginning of kneading the spices, my palms were sweating, and other places were not hot either. It was just a burning sensation in my palms. There were too many injured villagers, some of whom were seriously injured and needed a large amount of chicken tongue fragrance. It was only after dark that I made enough chicken tongue fragrance. I also brought those chicken tongue fragrances and went to the village chief's house under cover. One by one, yellow-orange chicken tongues were burning with a fragrant aroma, and a strong aroma of rice lingered over the sunken village. The villagers' roars and howls gradually weakened, and many of them fainted on the ground. Their wounds changed from purple-black to normal, and fresh red blood flowed from the wounds. Half of the incense burned, and most of the villagers have returned to normal, leaving only Grandma and the village chief with purple-red wounds due to severe injuries and prolonged delays. At this moment, the remaining half of the chicken tongue fragrance suddenly changed from yellow-orange to black, and the aroma of glutinous rice also became extremely foul-smelling. I was shocked and almost reached out to extinguish the incense. I slapped my grandmother, who had regained her senses, and scolded, "If the incense is ignited, it cannot be cut off halfway. Cutting it off will attract lonely souls and wild ghosts from 100 miles away to steal food, and it will cause great disaster." Chapter 8. Ghost Shaving the Head. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The stench continued to emanate, and the village chief's mood began to become unstable again, with occasional low growls. After suffering a loss, I immediately found a few thick ropes to tie up the village chief again. I was so anxious that my hands and feet were trembling. Can't I extinguish it? Let this incense burn all the time. That's okay. I furrowed my brows and couldn't help but wonder. Even though the rice in the jar had already been checked and there were no taboos, I watched the entire process of making incense without making any mistakes. There was no problem with the chicken tongue fragrance when it was first ignited. How could it change halfway through? I tried my best to recall the entire process, and indeed there were no mistakes. My milk suddenly sniffed my nose and asked, "Hazelnut, do you smell any fragrance?" I also carefully smelled it and smelled a faint aroma of tea, which emanated from the palm of my hand. The smell of the tea is exactly the same as the cup of tea Tongji gave me to drink. I told my milk about this and said, "When I was kneading the spices just now, my palms started to heat and sweat, and I still have sweat in my palms." I held my hand and sniffed it carefully for a while before saying, "It's sparrow tongue tea. There's something added inside." Tongji calculated the time accurately and helped you save the villagers, but kept a backhand. The fragrance of chicken tongue has changed to sparrow tongue, and sparrows have multiple tongues, which can easily cause trouble and only aggravate the evil energy of the yellow immortal. I blamed myself and said, "It's all because I wasn't careful enough. If I had known, I shouldn't have drunk the tea he gave me." This kind of thing is impossible to prevent, and Tong Jixian, an old fox, is not something that ordinary people can handle. Grandma squinted her eyes and calculated, although he moved, he didn't really take anyone's life immediately. He's hanging you like this, asking you to go back and beg him. I frowned and analyzed. At that time, I gave him a bank card, but he didn't want it. He just repeatedly emphasized his friendship with my grandfather, so he wasn't seeking wealth. The Liu family can only give him these few remaining incense sticks now. My milk asked, "Did you find anything wrong with your visit to the Tong family this time?" "There are too many things wrong with the Tong family." I told me everything I heard at the steamed bun shop, what I saw at the Tong family, and about the crazy man in the village. I listened attentively as I finished speaking, and with a sharp tap of my finger on the table, I made a decision. If my speculation is correct, Tong Jia's head has been shaved by ghosts. I have heard many versions of the legend of ghosts shaving their heads. To sum up, a living person offends a ghost, gets revenge from the ghost, and overnight gets their hair cut off by the ghost. When the little granddaughter of the Tong family died, she had no hair on her head. Today, when I was at the Tong family, I saw many people wearing hats and unable to see their hair, mostly young people. This revenge seems to have started with the younger generation of the Tong family. Tong Jishan was born in a duel and is proficient in feng shui techniques. He doesn't even pay attention to ordinary evil spirits, my milk continued. Even he can't suppress this evil spirit. Ordinary yin incense may not be useful. Is it because what he wants is the fragrance of tea leaves? The story of the Tu Mi Hua is over. Tu Mi Hua is the last flower of spring, symbolizing that everything is about to end. Therefore, Tong Jishan wanted to end the disaster of the Tong family with the fragrance of Tu Mi Hua, right? I asked. I nodded and said, that's exactly what he meant. But if you buy the fragrance of the mandala fragrance from the Yin official, the effect of the made mandala fragrance can only last one night. The Liu family Yin fragrance hall has been closed for 100 years, how could the mandala fragrance still be passed down? I remember that among the remaining 9 incense sticks, there was indeed no one named Tu Song Xiang. I came to the conclusion in my heart. Tong Jishan knew Grandpa so well that he may not have known that we still have incense in our hands. He didn't come to seek incense before, so he probably wanted to wait for this opportunity. After I took over the incense hall, he forced me to come and make incense for him. So, is Tong Jishan currently holding the fragrant tea leaves in his hand, or does he want to use my hand and the Yin Xiang hall to make the fragrant tea leaves? Anyway, I was targeted by Tong Jishan. I clenched my grandmother's hand and said, since the Tong family is coming for me, I'll go back to the Tong family again. They have a request for me, so they won't give me any more trouble. My pastor has really grown up, I patted my hand and warned, but pastor, remember that no matter when, your own life is the most important. If you can't make it, let's run away, do you hear me? I didn't want my grandmother to worry, so I nodded hard and said, okay. The chicken tongue was almost burning to the end, and my milk's eyes were slowly turning red. She asked me to bring a rope and tied her up as well. I got on the car holding a box containing an empty pottery jar and drove towards the south of the town again. It was already dark, and shortly after the car hit the mountain road, the sound of my milk suddenly came from behind. She anxiously shouted, Zhenzhen, wait for Grandma. Grandma will go to Tong's house with you. I looked back in the rearview mirror and really saw my breasts chasing after the van, waving their hands non-stop. But my milk is tied up at the village chief's house now, how could it come out to chase me? Also, I'm already over 70 years old and have suffered such a serious injury to my thighs. How could I run so fast? I accelerated, the person also accelerated, I slowed down, and the person also slowed down their pace, always following behind the van, shouting hysterically. I knew I was being targeted by something unclean, with a layer of cold sweat on my forehead and unstable thoughts. I almost overturned the car several times. At that moment, the little girl suddenly appeared in the passenger seat, startling me. She reminded, sister, don't look back, and don't pay attention to that person. That's not your grandmother. I glanced at her, she looked very bad, her soul almost transparent. Thinking that she was bitten by a weasel to save me, I couldn't help but ask, where did you go during the day? I have been seriously injured and my soul is too weak. I dare not come out during the day while hiding in the dark. She tilted her head to look at me and asked, sister, are you going to the Tong family in Zhennan? The mountain road was dark and difficult to walk, and the thing behind me was chasing closely. Since the little girl got on the car, that thing never came again. It was only then that my heart calmed down and I told her about what happened at the Tong family today. She listened very attentively and didn't say anything after listening. I asked her what her plans were for the future. She couldn't just hide during the day and come out to wander at night, could she? The little girl shook her head and gave me a sweet smile, saying, Sister crossed me with Buddhist bones and helped me escape the confinement of the hospital. Before the rooster crowed in the second half of the night, I had a chance to be reincarnated. I am genuinely happy for her. Reincarnation is better than being a lonely ghost. We were chatting like this, each person and ghost, and surprisingly, our car drove into Huilong village without realizing it. The door of the Tong family was open, with bright lights, indicating that someone was waiting for them. I held the box and strode inside. Tong Jixin was waiting for me in the hall, and I placed the box on the table. My eyes were fixed on him for a moment, and he threw it to the ground with a loud voice, saying, Tong Lauda is highly respected and should not fool a respected junior like this. Girl, you're being serious. I didn't mean to fool you, Tong Jixin said calmly. It's just that the Liu family's incense is precious. If I don't hold some chips in my hand, the lives of the 37 members of the Tong family will all be buried in the underworld, and I have no choice. I gritted my teeth and said, Tong Lao gave me rice in a jar and saved the lives of the villagers in the sunken water village. It is indeed a kindness to me. Sister doesn't owe anything to the Tong family. The little girl's voice suddenly sounded, and I don't know when she followed in. I thought she was still in the car. I hadn't spoken yet, but Tong Jixin lost his voice and called out, Wan Wan, is that you, my good granddaughter? I'm stunned. The little girl is actually the little granddaughter of the Tong family who just passed away last month. Chapter 9. This farewell is forever. You are listening at novelfull.audio. I looked back, but I didn't even recognize the soul body standing outside the threshold at this moment. The little girl with a doll-like face, combing her sister's hair, always smiling at me with big eyes, is now bald and covered in corpse spots. The wide blue and white striped hospital gown drapes over her dry and lifeless body, swaying. She stood there, her big eyes deeply recessed into her sockets, making people look both heartbroken and somewhat scared. Tong Jixin's shrewd triangular eyes were now filled with tears, mixed with emotions of reluctance, pain, self-blame, and so on. He opened his arms and trembled as he approached. In the horizontal thrust, a figure had already rushed forward first, reaching out to embrace the little girl and choking up, saying, Wan Wan, my Wan Wan, you finally came back to find your mother. Mom misses you so much. But her hands passed through the little girl's soul, unable to hold anything. She was stunned for a moment, then reached out to hold her again, holding her 3 or 4 times in a row, all with the same result. The woman cried, wailing loudly. She kept reaching out to grab and hug, with too much movement. The hat on her head fell off to the ground, revealing her bare head. She looked at the hat on the ground, then reached out to touch her bald head. Suddenly, she laughed and tears flowed down her face. She squatted in front of the little girl and coaxed her with a spoiled tone, Wan Wan is not afraid, not afraid. Look, Mom, like you, has no hair. Soon, Mom will be able to accompany you. Mom will accompany Wan Wan and she will never lose her again. The little girl's soul gradually returned to its previous state. She reached out her hand and pretended to embrace the woman, saying, Wan Wan doesn't want my mother to accompany me. Sister Zhen crossed me with a Buddha bone, giving me a chance to reincarnate. Wan Wan hopes that my mother will also live well, so that Wan Wan can leave with peace of mind. Mom, promise me to live well. The woman shed even more tears. She trembled her lips and couldn't speak. I think she knew her body had run out of oil and dried up. She didn't want to deceive her beloved daughter, but couldn't bear to disappoint her. She looked at her daughter and then at Tong Jixin. Tong Jixin then said, Xiao Qin, you go back and rest first. I have something to say to Wan Wan. The woman refused, shook her head, and kept crying until her husband came over and carried her out. Tong Jixin squatted in front of the little girl and asked in a loving voice, Wan Wan, are you going to be reincarnated soon? The little girl nodded vigorously and said seriously, "Grandpa, my soul was imprisoned in the hospital by the evil ghost and almost swallowed by it. My dear sister sacrificed a little toe to save me. Before the rooster crowed in the second half of the night, I was going to be reincarnated. But since my sister is kind to Huangquan, our Tong family cannot forget our kindness. Not only will we not repay her, but we will also calculate and force her. Huangquan believes that Grandpa will not do such a thing, right?" I couldn't help feeling some guilt as I listened to the little girl's words. At that time, I nodded and agreed to let her bite me, not purely to save her. At that time, I thought I was in a dream. Although I sacrificed a little toe, she was almost swallowed by a weasel in the car to save me. In this way of calculation, I am not really grateful to her. I opened my mouth and wanted to say something. The little girl shook her head at me and then said to Tong Jishan, "The ancestors of the Tong family made a living by fighting, and my grandfather is a true feng shui master. Before, you always said that when Huangquan grew up, you would teach her all the feng shui techniques. Unfortunately, Huangquan didn't have the opportunity to learn anymore, but Huangquan hopes that the Zhen sister can replace Huangquan and learn feng shui techniques from her grandfather. Is that okay?" I was a bit confused. Tong Huan asked me to learn feng shui techniques from Tong Jishan, which was to completely bind the two families of Tong Lu together. The reopening of the Lu family Yin Xiang hall is difficult, and I have no clue at all. If Tong Jishan were to provide me with support, everything would have become much easier. In this way, Tong Jishan's previous calculations and my various difficulties were transformed into a win-win situation. I made incense to save 37 members of the Tong family, and the Tong family escorted me to reopen the incense hall. What I can think of, Tong Jishan must have thought deeper and more thoroughly than I do. How could he not understand Tong Huan's thoughts? He is hesitating, weighing the pros and cons. He has 1,000 ways to force me to comply. If it weren't for Tong Huan mediating, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to stand here and negotiate terms with him. Tong Huan twisted her small body and coquettishly said, "Grandpa, this is my granddaughter's last wish. You can agree to it, please." Finally, Tong Jishan nodded and reached out to touch Tong Huan's head, his voice hoarse as he said, "It was my grandfather who made a mistake and brought the disaster back to the Tong family, causing the death of my beloved Huangquan. It was all my grandfather's fault, and Huangquan agreed to any requests she made." Tong Huan reached out and hugged Tong Jishan, saying, "Noa Noa, I knew my grandfather loved me the most, and I also loved him the most." At this moment, Tong Jishan burst into tears. Grandparents and grandchildren stood one by one, and 1.5 knelt on the ground, as if there was something indescribable. I stood on the side and watched quietly, thinking that after the crowing of the rooster, Tong Huan would go to reincarnation. This farewell is forever, and I couldn't help feeling sad for them. They chatted for a long time, and finally Tong Ji asked Tong Huan to say goodbye to her parents before he stood up. Tong Huan said some words to me, said goodbye, and then reluctantly left. I looked at Tong Huan's small and faint soul, unable to come to my senses for a long time. Until Tong Jishan let out a long sigh and said, "What a sensible little girl. She shouldn't have been so short-lived." I looked at Tong Jishan and waited for his words. He pinched his eyebrows hard, then looked up. His eyes had regained their previous shrewdness, and he changed the topic. "Actually, when the Tong family had just had an accident, I thought of the Liu family's Yin Xiang. I tried many ways to force your grandmother to comply and push you out to take over the Yin Xiang hall, but in the end, he couldn't take over. Who would have thought that if the sky didn't die for my Tong family, the Liu family's Yin Xiang hall would eventually reopen? Tong Lao, I have said that reopening the Yin fragrance hall was not my intention, I was to save people. I said truthfully, I don't have the fragrant tea leaves you wanted, nor do I have the fragrance guide for making tea leaves." Tong Jishan smiled silently and returned to his room, holding out another pottery jar and handing it to me, saying, go back and save your grandmother first, then pack up your clothes. Come to the Tong's house early tomorrow morning, and I will teach you feng shui techniques. I was sent back to Longsuan, and all the way back, I was wondering what medicine was in Tong Jixian's gourd. Does he keep silent about the issue of the fragrant tea leaves, feeling that my current abilities are not enough, or is it not intentional? Sure enough, dealing with such an old fox is exhausting. I had just parked my car at the entrance of the village chief's house, holding a pottery jar and getting off the car. The big rooster at the village chief's house started crowing loudly, and I suddenly shook myself. Looking up at the sky, it was already covered in fish belly white. The rooster crows, Tong Wan has already left. Chapter 10. Asking the Coffin 1. You are listening at Novel Full.audio. I clasped my hands together and silently prayed, hoping that Tong Wan would live a healthy and happy life. The villagers did not leave the village chief's house, they guarded the gate, afraid of releasing the village chief and my milk to cause trouble again. I brought back the rice in the jar and skillfully remade the chicken tongue fragrance. I have already made so many pieces, and this time I made them very quickly. 2 chicken tongues slowly burned to the end, and the village chief and my milk finally returned to normal. However, the wounds on our bodies still need time to heal slowly. After tinkering for 2 days, everyone was tired and went back to their respective homes. Let's rest for now and discuss other matters later. I helped my milk go back, helped her to bed, and let her sleep for a while I went to boil hot water and make breakfast. When I came back with a steaming hot meal, my breasts were awake. She leaned against the bedside and looked at me, asking, Zhen, did Tong Jixian ask you to help him make the fragrant tea leaves? I shook my head and explained the whole story to my nurse. After hearing this, I frowned and said, the lives of 37 people in the Tong family are in danger. Why doesn't he seem to be in a hurry at all? I couldn't figure it out, so I could only advise Milk to eat first. Milk, eat first, taking care of the body is more important than anything else. My Milk took over the job, ate a few mouthfuls and then put it down again. She took my hand and said, anyway, if the Lujia Yin Xiang hall reopens, we will inevitably have to deal with the Tongs. Tong Jixian is willing to teach you feng shui techniques, which is a good thing. You can learn from him in the future, keep an eye on dim sum, and don't let yourself suffer losses. I know, Milk. Since I have already promised Tong Jixian, I will not easily back out, let alone let my Milk worry for me. I comforted my Milk for a long time, and then asked my neighbors to help take care of my Milk. Only then did I pack my things and take a car back to Longsuan. For the next week, I stayed at Tong's house and spent every day soaking in Tong Jixian's study, desperately reading and taking notes. Tong Jixian is very strict. Even if I have a good memory and strong understanding ability, it is inevitable that I will make mistakes. Once I make a mistake, I will be scolded. He is merciless when fighting, saying while fighting, if you don't fight, you won't have a long memory. If you remember the knowledge points incorrectly now, you may end up dead in the future. Sometimes I still stand in the yard as a punishment. On July days, the sun is so poisonous, and I stand in horse steps under the sun, which is much harder than during military training. The Tong family has a large population, and there are always people coming and going in the yard. When they see me, although they are more familiar with me than before, they will nod and greet me, but the fear in their eyes remains unchanged. I have also met a few crazy men in the village. He wanders back and forth in Huilong village every day, occasionally muttering to himself, we all have to die. We all have to die. Ha ha ha. I have carefully observed him and found that although he is crazy, he has never hurt anyone. That day, I met a crazy man again. He walked towards me with a stick in his hand, pulling the weeds on the roadside as he walked. When he saw me, he laughed heartily, we all have to die. We all have to die. We can't run away. We can't run away. I couldn't help but ask, why can't we run away? Why do we all have to die? The crazy man was stunned for a moment. It was obvious that no one had asked him such a question for a long time. He stared at me for a long time before suddenly covering his eyes and exclaiming, "I didn't see that painting, I didn't see anything. Don't come to me, don't come to me. I am covered in mist." "What painting? Who is looking for him?" I reached out to pull him, wanting to ask again. As soon as I touched him, he felt as if he had been scalded and jumped up, howling and running away. "Ghost! Ghost! She came to find me, she came to find me. Ghosts! He also treats me like a ghost. Why? Why on earth?" I returned to the Tong family feeling lost and disoriented. As soon as I entered, Tong Jingchen called me over and threw me a cloth bag containing some commonly used magical tools. He said, "You have been learning feng shui techniques with me for a week now. Today, I received an urgent order to take you out to inspect the results." I was shocked and said, "Me? Acceptance results? I have only been studying for a week. Even if I have exceptional talent, I won't be able to stand alone, will I?" Tong Jingchen glared at me and said without hesitation, "With me around, are you still afraid of losing your life?" "I think so too. Besides, my arm can't twist my thigh, and he can also be considered my master. If my master wants to test me, can I not go?" The driver is Tong Xuyan, the youngest nephew of Tong Jingchen. He is 39 years old and is the most talented among the younger generation, apart from Tong Wan. He has been studying with Tong Jingchen since childhood. Tong Jingchen and I sat in the back row, listening to him describe the order he took over today. That family, surnamed Xian, is one of the top wealthy households in the county. The elderly lady in charge drove a crane to the west a few days ago, and the funeral was held with great solemnity. She even asked the feng shui master to calculate the auspicious time for the burial, which was at October 18, noon today. However, the auspicious time had arrived, and the 8 heavy lifting men were unable to lift the old lady's coffin. Upon hearing this, I immediately said, "If the coffin of longevity cannot be raised, there must be injustice. The best way to solve this evil is to ask the coffin." Tong Jingchen nodded in approval and said, "I have learned theoretical knowledge well, but I can only talk on paper. Today, I will take this opportunity to let you practice your skills." Earlier, Tong Xuyan also said, "Miss Liu, don't worry. We have all come from this stage, and when the sky falls, my uncle is holding us back." I responded with a detailed understanding of the Qian family's family situation. The reason why the Qian family was able to make a fortune was thanks to the support of Mrs. Qian's mother's family. The old lady lived to 83 years old and went to bed. Her 4 sons worked together to handle the affairs, which was both dignified and prosperous. However, they didn't expect to get stuck in the final stage. I went through the process of asking about the coffin in my mind, and then checked the magic tools in the cloth bag to make sure they were sufficient. Only then did I feel relieved. The car drove into the Qian family mansion, and I got off the car and headed straight for the Lingtang. At this moment, the morning hall was filled with a grand roar, and everyone was discussing the Qian family. Mrs. Qian's longevity coffin was parked steadily in the hall, with nails nailed and ropes tied around it. 8 heavy men were gathered around the coffin with a worried expression on their faces. The 4 sons of the Qian family welcomed me, and they all knew Tong Jingchen. After a few polite words, Tong Jingchen introduced me and said, "This is my disciple Liu Zhenzhen who closed the door. I will fully entrust her to handle your family's affairs." The leader of the Qian family questioned, "Does Miss Liu look so young and mature?" "I'm 19 years old this year. I tried my best to appear calm, I have my own way to solve Mrs. Qian's problem. Whether it works or not, let's give it a try." The 4th member of the Qian family almost jumped up and accused me, saying, "Our Qian family has a big business and can't afford to pay. Find a yellow-haired girl to take care of my old lady's affairs." "Dong, what do you mean by this? In this commotion, everyone shook their heads. Even though I hadn't done anything, I was completely denied. If I can't handle this today, I will definitely be beaten by Tong Jixin when I go back. With a grit of my teeth, I scanned the morning hall for a week, found the spirit flag leaning against the wall, walked over in 3 or 2 steps, picked up the spirit flag, and forcefully inserted it into the ground. Then he shouted to the crowd, "Let's all be quiet. I, Liu Zhenzhen, have taken over the matter of Mrs. Qian. As the saying goes, if you can't afford a longevity coffin, there must be injustice. Next, I will ask for the coffin on behalf of my master and hope everyone can cooperate." I pointed to the spiritual banner inserted into the ground and shouted loudly, "The eldest son carries the banner."